Let's talk about arguments for the existence of God today. What do we want to say then about the ontological argument, the philosopher's invention, as I referred to it? You might be able to tell what I'm going to say about the ontological argument from this rather disparaging characterization of it. But that would be a mistake. The ontological argument is a philosopher's invention. It's not something you find ordinary people on the street without philosophical training citing. It's just not, it's too fancy an argument in some sense or other for that. So what should we say about it? What is the ontological argument? As I said, the fundamental key conceptual slogan for it is the greatest possible being. Sometimes it's referred to as the greatest possible being, sometimes maximal perfection, sometimes maximally perfect being. But the idea is that this very concept, the concept of a maximally perfect being, is somehow supposed to guarantee the existence of such a being. The argument first appears in history in Anselm. The argument is something like this, where P is the claim that the proper understanding of the nature of God is that of a maximally perfect being, and G is the claim that God exists. You can derive the second from the first. So let P be the conceptual account of the nature of God. So that's P. Let G be the claim God exists. The claim has to be, for an ontological argument, that P gives us suitable grounds for deriving G. G follows from P. Now, this argument, though discovered by Anselm, became extremely popular in modern philosophy, especially among the philosophers termed the rationalists. So you can find versions of the argument in Descartes, in Spinoza, in Leibniz. More recently, in the 20th century, you can find a fascinating version of it in the work of Kurt Gödel, most famous for his proofs of the incompleteness of arithmetic. You can also find it in Charles Hartshorn, famous process theologian of the 20th century. Actually, an interesting story about Hartshorn. He claims to have philosophized in 3 centuries because he was born in either 1898 or 99, and he didn't die until 2001. And he claimed to have had philosophical thoughts as an infant. Maybe he did. Anyway, a fascinating human being, taught for a long time at Emory, taught at UT, Texas, and a really interesting process thinker. Very suspicious of classical theism, rejected much of it in favor of what he called process theism. But it didn't change the fact that he did like the ontological argument and defended a version of it. Another version can be found in the work of Norman Malcolm. We'll see references to this when we look at the readings. We're going to read some stuff by Plantinga. And Plantinga has his own special version of the argument. But there has been serious resistance to the argument as well. Aquinas, for example, was not a fan of the ontological argument. Neither was Hume. Kant famously said the argument was terrible because existence isn't a predicate, which is a rather bizarre cross-category claim if you think about it. Predicates are linguistic items, and it's not surprising to find out that existence itself is not a grammatical predicate. So obviously he had something else in mind other than claiming that existence wasn't a piece of language. That's trivially true and certainly doesn't undermine the ontological argument, but perhaps there's some deeper thought behind that. A more sophisticated version of this challenge can be found in Frege, because Frege claimed that existence is a second-order property. It's a property of properties rather than a property. Or, if you prefer to put it in grammatical form, it is a predicate concerning predicates rather than itself a first-order predicate that characterizes objects. So Frege thought existence is a special kind of predicate in a language, and its special character prevented it from attaching to objects. So you can't get God's existence from some characterization of the nature of God. That would be to confuse existence as a first-order predicate with a second-order predicate. There is a little piece of interesting historical trivia here. Hegel also liked the ontological argument, in contrast with Kant. What's fascinating about this is Hegel said he liked the argument, but he never tells you what that argument is. Now that would be okay, I suppose, if there were a well-known standard one ontological argument, but it turns out there's lots of them. Norman Malcolm, for example, claimed he could find two different ones in Anselm's own work. So, at least from the beginning, perhaps there was more than one ontological argument. But by the time you get to Hegel, you've already had Descartes' version of the ontological argument, Leibniz's, Spinoza's. There have been lots of formulations of the ontological argument. So here it's a little funny to find somebody saying they like the ontological argument. They think it's sound, but they don't actually tell you what it is. That makes it a little bit hard to undermine the argument that Hegel liked the best. Let's turn then to Plantinga's version of the argument. This will anticipate a little bit of our discussion. I'm not going to do the critical parts of discussing Plantinga's argument until we get to the readings, but this will anticipate the readings a bit. So this isn't exactly Plantinga's argument. Plantinga's argument uses slightly different wording. So let's start with the claim that God is a maximally great being. Start with that claim. The first premise of the argument has to tell us that such a being is possible. If it turns out such a being is impossible, then it just means we've got an incoherent concept, like the concept of a round square. Obviously, if you start with an incoherent concept, no piece of reasoning about it is going to get you anything about what reality is like or is not like. The simple reason for that is if you start from a contradiction, you can prove everything, absolutely everything. So let's start with the first premise. It's possible that a maximally great being exists. So the central first concept is the concept of maximal greatness. Now, the first thing Plantinga wants to do is connect this language of possibility with the standard semantics for modality. The standard semantics for modal reasoning is possible world semantics. The devices that it uses for understanding what it is for a claim to be possible is the notion of a possible world. Okay, so let's do that. A possible world is a total way things might have been. So it's complete. It's not just partial. I mean, the wind didn't have to be blowing today, but that's just a partial fact about my particular local corner of the world. So the first two key concepts of the argument are the possibility claim and second, the notion of maximal greatness. So what is this notion of maximal greatness? Well, let's go to this world where such a maximally great being exists. So now we're going to find out something about what maximal greatness entails. Maximal greatness requires maximal excellence. Well, we'll see later on why we want to distinguish these two notions. But maximal excellence has to do with having properties that are excellent, better to have than not in some sense or other. And the standard account of such properties gives us classical theism. What do you have to be like to be maximally excellent? Well, you have to be powerful. I mean, if you have no powers at all, you're not that impressive. Well, so what's the maximal amount of power you could have? All power, being all powerful. So you have to be omnipotent. Okay, so power is a good thing, knowledge is a good thing. How much knowledge do you have to have? Well, you have to know everything. You have to know all that can be known, something along those lines. Call that omniscience. Well, to be excellent, you have to be good. How good do you have to be? More good than bad? A lot more good than bad? Well, once again, there's a maximal notion, being perfectly good. So call that omnibenevolence. That's a hard word to say. Call that omnibenevolence. So basically, to be maximally excellent in a world, you have to be an omni-being in that world. Okay, so we have the possibility claim, we have the notion of maximal greatness, and we have maximal excellence in a world which ties us to the standard omni properties. Okay, so that's fine. You're now in a world where the God of classical theism, the God of at least Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Abrahamic traditions, exists. That's fine. That's easy enough to endorse, at least if you don't see where this is going. But at least it's easy enough to endorse at this point. It doesn't look like the God of classical theism is intrinsically incoherent, at least not in any obvious way. So if it's coherent, there will be a world in which it's realized. So let's just say God exists in at least one world. How do we get the God of that world into our world? How do we do that? Well, let's try it this way. Suppose you have a power. Suppose you have an ability. I don't know what that ability is. Let's go back to when you were a little kid. So you're 4 years old, and you have this ability to do sums through 3-digit numbers in your head without having to write them down. Well, that's kind of cool. If you're 4 years old and you can do sums in your head perfectly at age 4 up through at least 999, that's kind of cool. Okay, so you have this ability. But remember, abilities, skills, and that sort of thing can have levels of fragility. So they can come and go pretty easily. Some of them are more durable, some of them are more fragile. But there's a maximal kind of fragility that an ability could have. So here's a maximally fragile ability characterization. Your ability to do sums in your head at age 4 is maximally fragile just when any change to the total history of the world, to the total story of the world, would result in the loss of that ability. So your ability to do sums in your head when you were 4 years old could depend on what you ate for lunch. If you hadn't had that peanut butter sandwich for lunch, you wouldn't have the ability. If you hadn't had Cheerios for breakfast, you wouldn't have that ability. Now generalize that completely so that your ability depends on everything about this possible world. That's a maximally fragile ability. So it's a bit more impressive if your ability to do sums in your head when you were 4 years old is not maximally fragile, but a little less fragile, a little more durable. We now have a scale of fragility from maximally fragile to maximally durable. What is this notion of maximal durability? Well, it's pretty easy to engage in the same reasoning we did about power and knowledge. Maximality involves a universal quantifier. For power, it was having all power. For knowledge, it was knowing everything. For durability rather than fragility, it's having an ability which you wouldn't lose no matter what were different about the world. Now remember, what's different about a world takes us to another possible world. So if you have a maximally durable ability or power or excellence, that's something that you have in every world in which you exist. That's called an essential property. An essential property of yours is a property that if you didn't have it, you wouldn't exist. You cannot exist without it. That's maximal durability. Okay, now we have to in some way connect this notion of an essential property with the notion of a property that you have in every world. Maximal durability can do that too. Because notice you can have a property that is both maximally durable and maximally fragile at the same time. Suppose your existence is maximally fragile. Suppose that if you were to have anything change at all about this world, we'd end up in a different possible world, but you wouldn't be there. Your existence is limited to this specific world. That's a very sad state of affairs to be in. You like to think of yourself as a little more durable than that, a little more resilient, a little less fragile. You have abilities. You don't want those abilities to be maximally fragile, but it's not just your abilities that are at stake. It's your existing in a world that's at stake in this case. So being maximally fragile can come in two different ways. One is where just your abilities or excellences are fragile. The other is where, no, your abilities aren't fragile because you have them in every world in which we can find you. It's just that you can't be found in many worlds. You are so fragile that, your abilities aren't fragile because you don't lose your abilities, but you are fragile. Anything that changes about the world in which we exist, any change at all would result in you not existing. So let's say the notion of a maximal excellence, you can't have a maximal excellence if you yourself are fragile or if the excellences themselves are fragile. You have to have maximal durability for both. And that's how you get from maximal excellence to existing in every possible world. So once we've gotten from maximal greatness to necessary existence, then the rest is the trivial first axiom of modal logic, which is anything necessary is actual. If P is necessary, then P is true. P in this case is the existence of a maximally great being. So we just got from the first premise, it's possible that a maximally great being exists, to a last premise where it's actually the case that a maximally great being exists. That is a philosopher's invention. Perhaps it's a wonderful invention. There have been lots of those in history. Perhaps it's sophistry. Lots of philosophers have thought that too. We'll consider this possibility more carefully when we investigate the readings and see what kinds of objections people have given to this reasoning.